Disclaimer: this story contains mature themes intended for adult viewers. Viewer discretion is advised. I didn't mean to follow him. Not like that. Not with my pulse betraying me and my husband standing only a few feet away watching the shift in the room like he felt it too but didn't know how to stop it. The first thing I noticed wasn't his voice, it was the certainty in the way he moved. Calm, deliberate. As if he already understood the invisible lines between us and had decided they didn't apply to him. When his hand brushed lightly against my lower back, it wasn't inappropriate. It wasn't even obvious. But it lingered a second too long, and in that second something changed. The air grew heavier. My breath grew thinner. My husband saw it. I know he did. We were supposed to be celebrating, a harmless evening among friends, laughter spilling across polished floors, glasses clinking under warm amber light. Nothing about the setting suggested danger. And yet when our eyes met across the room, I could see the tension gathering behind his calm expression. He wasn't jealous, not exactly. He was uncertain, as if he could feel control slipping through his fingers without knowing when he'd lost his grip. "I trust you," he had whispered earlier that evening. I wonder now if he was reassuring me or himself. When the other man leaned closer to speak, his voice was low, steady, almost instructive. He didn't demand attention. He commanded it without trying. I followed him toward the quieter end of the room reluctantly, telling myself it was only conversation, only curiosity, only politeness. But every step felt heavier than it should have. Charged. I told myself I could stop at any moment. The hallway lights were softer, shadows stretching along the walls like silent witnesses. He didn't corner me, he didn't trap me, he simply stood close enough that I could feel the warmth of him without being touched. His presence was a statement, his silence an invitation. "Are you uncomfortable?" he asked gently. The question should have made it easy to walk away. Instead it unsettled me. Because I wasn't uncomfortable. I was aware, intensely aware of him, of myself, of my husband at the far end of the room pretending not to watch while absolutely watching. And then it happened. The smallest gesture. His fingers lifted to adjust a strand of hair near my shoulder. Harmless, careful. Yet it felt like a shift in gravity. My body reacted before my thoughts did, responding to the firmness beneath his restraint. There was authority in his stillness. In the way he didn't need to say more. I followed his lead reluctantly, feeling the force of his confidence guide the space between us. Not forceful, not aggressive, just certain, as if he knew exactly how close to stand without crossing a line. And somehow that control was more powerful than if he had crossed it. Across the room my husband's posture stiffened, his jaw tightened slightly. He wasn't powerless. But he wasn't intervening either. Maybe he was waiting for me to step back. Maybe he believed I would. The truth? I wasn't sure. There was history there, unspoken chemistry threaded through shared glances over the past few weeks. Quick conversations that lasted too long. Smiles that felt like secrets. Nothing undeniable, nothing concrete, but enough to create a quiet tension neither of us had addressed. Until now. "Look at me," he murmured softly. And I did. In his eyes there was no mockery, no challenge, just something steady, intentional. He wasn't trying to take anything from me. He was offering something dangerous. Clarity. A reminder that attraction doesn't disappear simply because it's inconvenient. Behind us laughter erupted from the living room. The world continued as if nothing had shifted. But everything had. I felt the balance tilt, subtle but undeniable. I wasn't being pulled. I was choosing not to step away. And my husband, still watching, still silent, was witnessing that choice unfold in real time. The space between the three of us tightened like a drawn string. And just as his fingers brushed my wrist, firm, guiding, deliberate, the sound of approaching footsteps echoed down the hallway. Someone was coming. And in that suspended second I realized there was no going back to the way things were before. I could feel the weight of his gaze even before he spoke again. Words weren't necessary, never had been. Every glance, every slight tilt of his head carried the unspoken message between us. My pulse raced not with fear but with that sharp, undeniable awareness of being seen. Completely and intentionally by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He leaned slightly closer as if to speak, but the words never came. Instead, a quiet laughter escaped me, soft and unguarded, and it surprised both of us. That tiny sound created a crack in the tension, a small but thrilling space where something unspoken could exist. My hand brushed against his accidentally or maybe deliberately, and I felt it linger in the memory of the touch long after the contact ended. Every accidental brush seemed purposeful. And every purposeful gesture felt accidental, tangled in the magnetic pull between us. Behind us, the muffled clink of glasses and low conversation reminded me of reality. My husband was still there, watching silently, caught between caution and curiosity. And yet in that moment I didn't think about him at all. I only thought about the steady presence of the man guiding me, the careful way he respected the boundaries without stepping back, and the thrill it brought me to realize that I was willingly following him. "I didn't know you could look like that," he murmured softly, his voice low enough that only I could hear it. I froze for a heartbeat, caught off guard by the intimacy of the comment. My cheeks warmed, not from embarrassment but from the electric vulnerability of having someone notice the private corners of me that I rarely allowed anyone to see. His words weren't a compliment or a tease, they were an observation, a recognition that cut closer to the truth than I expected. I wanted to speak, to deflect, to change the subject. But no words came out. Instead our eyes held, a silent conversation spanning everything we didn't dare voice. Every movement was measured, yet every second stretched longer than it should. The air between us felt thick, almost tactile, as if it had weight. At some point my hand brushed the fabric of his sleeve, not intentionally, and yet not entirely by accident. He didn't recoil, he didn't seize it, he let it be, letting the moment exist without interference, as if honoring the delicate tension that both enticed and terrified me. I felt my heartbeat quicken, realizing that this simple gesture, a hand, a glance, a breath, could carry more weight than any spoken word. I glanced toward my husband briefly. He was trying to appear casual, but I could see the tightness in his jaw, the faint lift of an eyebrow, the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He was part of this world yet not in control of it. And for a fleeting instant I realized that the power in the room wasn't mine to claim. It belonged to the invisible line drawn between desire and restraint. The man guiding me smiled faintly, not smugly but knowingly, as if he had sensed every thought flickering across my mind. He didn't need to touch me to command attention, just existing in that space, confident and composed, made the world narrow down to the two of us. A soft sound behind us, the low murmur of a friend passing by, broke the moment, reminding us both of the boundaries still in place. And yet the air remained charged, simmering with what hadn't happened and what could, and it left me acutely aware that nothing would be the same again. The hallway felt smaller somehow, as if the space itself had shrunk around us to hold only the weight of unspoken words. I could feel his presence as acutely as my own heartbeat. Each step measured, each breath deliberate. Our hands hovered near each other, separated by inches that felt like miles. Every time our fingers brushed, it was a spark and a warning all at once. Neither of us moved closer, not because we didn't want to but because the intensity of the desire made the act almost too fragile to risk. He looked at me differently now, not merely observing but searching, as if trying to read every thought I was trying to hide. And in his eyes I saw my own restraint reflected back, magnified, a mirror of the walls I had built around my feelings, around the life I thought I was committed to. My chest tightened as I realized how much of myself I had left unspoken, tucked away behind polite smiles and quiet evenings. "You're quiet," he said softly, a comment that could have been innocent but wasn't. The way he said it made the words heavy, layered with curiosity and longing. I tried to smile, tried to laugh it off, but my lips felt heavier than usual. My voice when it came was small. "I'm just thinking about him, about the pull I felt toward him that I shouldn't, about the look on my husband's face when he watched us, restrained yet knowing, thinking about how each gesture, each accidental touch, each lingering glance, was rewriting the boundaries I had carefully drawn." I almost reached for him, almost leaned closer, but then I pulled back, a fraction too late, as if even the act of hesitation was part of the tension. My fingers grazed his sleeve again, this time longer, and I felt the warmth of his skin through the fine fabric. His hand stayed inches from mine, and the restraint in that tiny space between us was almost unbearable. It wasn't denial, it was restraint made beautiful, deliberate and necessary. We both carried invisible walls. Mine were built from years of habit and expectation, from the promises I had made and the life I had constructed. His, I realized, were different. Walls made of patience, caution and perhaps respect for the limits I hadn't voiced. Yet neither of those walls could shield us from the magnetic pull that had grown between us, as if the air itself conspired to bring us closer. The sound of laughter drifted from the living room. My husband was still there, a silent sentinel at the edge of our private storm. It made me ache in a way I didn't want to name. Not because of him but because his presence reminded me of what I could not do, of the lines I had no right to cross even though every instinct screamed otherwise. His gaze softened for a heartbeat, almost apologetic, almost tender. And then, as if acknowledging the impossibility of the moment, he shifted slightly, giving me space while holding the tension like a coiled spring. My own chest felt tight, a mix of longing and frustration that made the air feel almost too thick to breathe. We didn't speak again. We didn't need to. The unspoken was louder than words. The desire hung between us like a dense, palpable fog, impossible to ignore, impossible to act on, and impossible to escape. And yet neither of us moved away entirely, caught in the gravity of knowing that this fragile connection built on restraint and longing was both dangerous and intoxicating. For a long moment we simply existed in that space together, hands almost touching, hearts racing, and the unacknowledged truth that neither of us could forget this electric, forbidden tension. The air had grown impossibly thick, charged with a quiet energy that neither of us could name but both of us felt. Every subtle movement, the tilt of his head, the way his eyes softened when they found mine, the faint brush of my dress against his hand carried weight. The world outside that hallway, the living room filled with laughter, the polished floors and glowing lights had ceased to exist. There was only this. Him, me, the impossible pull between us. He began, his voice barely above a whisper. I caught the hesitation, the almost imperceptible tremor that betrayed the calm facade he had maintained all evening. He stopped, swallowed, and his eyes held mine, raw and searching, like he was trying to find a truth he wasn't sure he was ready to say. I could feel my own pulse in my throat, my heartbeat thudding loud enough that I was certain he could hear it. Words hovered on my lips, but none of them seemed sufficient. Nothing could capture the storm that had been building in stolen glances, in the brush of hands, in moments of accidental closeness. He stepped slightly closer, just enough that our shoulders almost touched. The electricity in that space was undeniable, almost painful in its intensity. My breath caught and I felt my fingers twitch, aching to bridge the gap, yet knowing that to act on that impulse would break the fragile balance we had been maintaining. "I've wanted to say something," he murmured, and the confession hung in the air, unfinished but heavy, like a promise. His gaze never wavered, steady, compelling, and it made me aware of everything I had been holding back, every fleeting thought, every stolen curiosity, every moment I had imagined what it might be like to let go. I wanted to speak, I wanted to move closer. My chest tightened with the gravity of what it meant to feel so completely exposed and yet so undeniably alive. But instead I let silence answer him, and that silence became our conversation. It was louder than words. It was intimacy distilled to its purest form, the raw acknowledgement of longing without surrender. Our hands hovered near each other again, trembling slightly, fingertips almost grazing the space between us. There was a gravity to the moment, as if the air itself had condensed around our shared tension. I felt the warmth of him, the subtle scent that seemed to anchor me to him, and the impossibility of the distance that remained only heightened the ache. I began, my voice a soft, almost broken echo of his own confession. But I stopped, because even this attempt at speech felt too dangerous, too honest for the fragile world we were navigating. For one long heartbeat we simply existed together, breathing the same air, suspended between hesitation and surrender. Every glance, every almost touch, every unspoken word was amplified in that charged stillness. My heart raced, my body alert to every nuance of his presence, every inch of proximity, every sigh that trembled at the edge of acknowledgement. And then he leaned ever so slightly closer, not enough to cross the line, not enough to break what remained, but close enough that I felt the heat of him as if our souls had touched. My own breath caught. The moment stretched, elastic and impossible, and in that second I knew the line had been drawn. The tension had peaked, and nothing would ever feel the same again. We didn't speak, we didn't move, we simply held the suspended reality of what could be, and it was enough. Too much. Perfect. The rain had begun softly outside, tapping against the windows like a quiet heartbeat, matching the rhythm that had taken over my own chest. The warm glow of the living room lights spilled across the polished floor, casting golden reflections that danced over him and me. Everything else faded. The world outside, the lingering voices of guests, the weight of expectation. There was only the two of us, suspended in a moment that felt both fragile and infinite. I could feel him before I even reached him, an invisible gravity pulling me closer. Our eyes met, and in them I saw every word we had left unsaid, every glance we had stolen, every secret longing we had buried behind smiles and restraint. My hand brushed his arm almost by accident, and the contact sent a ripple through me, a tremor that spoke louder than any confession. His hand moved slightly, responding, but not too fast, letting the touch linger, letting the moment breathe. Her breath caught, or maybe it was mine. The distinction didn't matter anymore. The space between us was electric, charged with anticipation, with every unsaid word finally finding expression in the simple nearness of our bodies. His gaze softened, warm and steady, and I let my own fall for a moment, letting the tension we had carried for weeks dissolve into something palpable and tender. The room smelled faintly of rain and warm wood, and in that mix there was the invisible intimacy of shared vulnerability. Their shoulders almost brushed, and my breath melted into his. Time slowed, every second stretching long enough to feel the pull of his presence, the subtle warmth of him beside me, the way our bodies could communicate what words could not. We moved closer, though not deliberately. The motion was instinctive, a natural answer to the tension that had held us captive. A sigh escaped, soft and unguarded, and I realized how much I had craved this. Craved the feeling of being seen, of being known, of letting the world fall away until it was only us. Our foreheads nearly touched, and in that closeness we shared the weight of everything that had built between us: longing, desire, restraint, and the joy of finally surrendering to the quiet pull of our connection. The rain grew heavier, drumming against the glass, a steady rhythm that mirrored the slow, deliberate awareness of each other. Every breath, every heartbeat, every inch of proximity spoke more eloquently than any words could. His hand rested lightly near mine, almost brushing, almost claiming, but the almost was perfect because it allowed the tension to linger while letting the intimacy reach its peak. In that suspended moment, everything spoke: the warmth of our skin, the shallow breaths mingling in the shared space, the quiet electricity of a connection finally acknowledged. The night itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting, reverent, as if honoring the unspoken poetry of this intimacy. Every lingering touch, every glance, every heartbeat was a declaration, a testament to the depth of emotion that neither of us had dared to voice until now. When we finally stepped back just slightly, it wasn't a retreat. It was the echo of what had passed, an understanding, a shared exhilaration, a reminder that in the space between restraint and surrender, something breathtaking had happened. The morning light came slow and soft, spilling across the room in pale gold streaks. The world outside was calm. The rain finally faded into quiet puddles on the windowsill, but inside, everything felt heavy and unsteady. The warmth of last night lingered, not in touch, not in sound, but in the quiet residue of what had passed. Moments suspended between desire, surrender, and understanding. I sat at the edge of the sofa, fingers tracing the faint pattern of the fabric, remembering the subtle press of his presence, the unspoken confessions held in glances, the almost touch that had felt more profound than any words. The intimacy had been undeniable, yet it carried a weight that pressed against the edges of my thoughts now, an echo that was both exhilarating and terrifying. He was across the room, leaning against the doorway with his hands tucked into his pockets, his posture casual but his gaze heavy, lingering. Neither of us spoke. The silence was full, rich with meaning. We had crossed an invisible line, yet we hadn't broken anything. And still the air between us felt fragile, like it could shatter if we moved too fast or too carelessly. I thought of my husband, where he was, what he thought, what he felt. The memory of him waiting silently last night, restrained but present, added a layer of guilt I couldn't ignore. The lines between right and wrong blurred in the quiet morning, leaving only the truth of what had been shared between the two of us. Was it love? Was it escape? Or something more complicated, something raw and human, that didn't fit neatly into the boxes we were taught to live by? My fingers brushed against the coffee cup on the table. Warm, grounding, ordinary. I wanted to speak, to articulate the tumult inside me, but words felt too small, too clumsy. He stepped closer, the sound of his steps deliberate, careful. I could feel the gravity of him without needing him to say a thing. "You're quiet," he murmured softly. The same words as last night, but now laden with reflection, awareness, and perhaps guilt of his own. I faltered. My voice was hushed, hesitant. I didn't know if I could explain. I didn't know if I wanted to. There was a sudden knock at the door, sharp and unexpected, slicing through the fragile bubble of tension. We froze, exchanged a glance, and in that instant the outside world intruded. I opened the door, and standing there was someone I hadn't expected, a friend. Someone who carried news that threatened to unbalance everything again. Their eyes were wide, scanning the room, and for a fleeting second I saw the fragile reality of last night's surrender reflected back at me, mirrored in someone else's awareness. The moment stretched. Silence hung thick. But underneath it all, a connection had been forged that no surprise, no confession, no knock at the door could undo. The heat, the longing, the unspoken words, they were now embedded in us, shaping how we would look at each other, how we would move, how we would navigate the complicated, messy, human aftermath of what had happened. There was no resolution yet, no clarity, but there was presence, there was acknowledgement, and as the morning light spilled over us, quiet, warm, and persistent, I understood something undeniable. Whatever else came, this connection would not fade. It was alive, tangled, and breathtakingly real. The evening light had softened into a warm amber, spilling across the room like a gentle embrace. After everything that had passed, the quiet tension, the stolen moments, the lingering electricity, we finally allowed ourselves to exist in the calm after the storm. No words were necessary. Our breaths had synchronized over countless unspoken conversations, over glances and almost touches that had spoken louder than any confession. He reached for my hand, slowly, deliberately, and I let him. No sudden movements, no urgency, just the quiet acknowledgement that we had found something neither of us had expected and that neither of us could ignore. Our fingers intertwined like the resolution of a long-held question, fitting together as though they had been meant to find each other all along. I rested my head briefly against his chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat beneath me. It was grounding, soft, and overwhelmingly tender. There had been no grand declarations, no dramatic proclamations, only presence, and the warmth of two hearts choosing to stay in the quiet, sacred space they had carved for themselves. He lifted my chin gently, brushing his lips against my forehead. The gesture was simple, almost invisible, yet it carried the weight of all the longing, all the hesitation, all the shared secrets that had defined our journey. I closed my eyes, letting the moment stretch, allowing the calm to seep into the corners of my mind that had been taut with desire and uncertainty. There was no rush, no need to define what came next. The room was full of soft shadows and reflections from the low-hanging lights, the air scented faintly with rain that had dried on the windows, carrying a memory of the night we had finally surrendered to one another. It was quiet but full of understanding, intimacy, and the kind of connection that lingers long after words fail. If this was where our paths would remain, I felt no fear. There was a slow, deliberate peace in the choice to stay together, a quiet fire beneath the surface that promised depth without chaos. If we were destined to part, I knew the memory would remain like a delicate perfume, unforgettable in its subtlety, a touchstone in our lives that neither time nor distance could erase. Either way, the imprint of what had happened, this raw, human, undeniable connection, would echo in our hearts forever. I tilted my head back toward him, meeting his eyes one last time in that room suspended between what had been and what would be. There was no need to speak. The closeness, the warmth, the heartbeat we shared, and the gentle pressure of hands against hands said everything. And in that silence I understood fully that some connections are meant to stay with us, quietly, profoundly, shaping who we are long after the moment has passed. It was over, but it was complete, and that completeness was enough.